thank you all for being here. My name is Aria Rao. I'm the President and Chief Editorial Officer of the Columbia Undergraduate Science Journal and the President of the National Undergraduate Consortium of Science Journals. So a bit of a mouthful. I'd like to introduce Elin Hu, our Communications Director and the moderator for this panel. So Elin, you can go ahead and take it away.
Sure, thank you, Aria. It's great to be here. Like she said, I am the Communications Director at the Columbia Undergraduate Science Journal. And yeah, welcome to our last panel today. This is Careers in Scientific Journalism and Communication, and we'll be discussing the role of scientific journalism and communication in future paths, career paths for undergraduate scientists. It's such a pleasure to be your moderator today. And before we begin with introductions and questions, I just want to note that everyone is welcome to ask questions in the Q&A tab, and we'll get to those questions at the end of the talk. So I'm so excited to introduce to you our four wonderful panelists, Dr. Scott Solomon, Ms. Amy Ellis Nutt, Dr. Todd Newman, and Ms. Apurva Mandavili. If you could all introduce yourselves, that'd be great. And we can start with Dr. Solomon.
Yeah, Scott Solomon. I'm an associate teaching professor at Rice University in Houston.
I'm Amy Nutt. The only reason my middle name is in my byline is because my mother insisted so that my name was longer on the paper. I most recently was at the Washington Post as a science writer, specializing in neuroscience and mental health, and now I'm working on books full-time.
Hi, everyone. My name is Todd Newman. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Life Sciences Communication at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I consider myself a science communication researcher, so excited to be here and add those perspectives.
That's cool.
Hi, everybody. My name is Apurva Mandavili. I'm a science reporter at the New York Times, where I write about infectious diseases and global health mostly. And so, as you can imagine, I've been writing about COVID for the last several months.
Oh my God. Have you been sleeping at all?
Actually, yeah, I would say yes. But I do think every waking moment is spent on COVID reporting.
Great. Well, it's great to hear from all of you all. And I'd love for this to be an open conversation. We can start with an order with our questions, but anyone is welcome to jump in at any time and answer a question. And, you know, you guys are already a little bit familiar with each other, so that's great. And yeah, we'll get started with the questions. So my first question is, what led you to a career in scientific journalism, and what factors affected this choice?
I can go. I started out actually being a science geek and wanting to do research. And I worked every summer as an undergraduate. I went to grad school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison to get a PhD in biochemistry. And about 4 years in, I decided I really didn't want to be a scientist, that I loved science, but I wanted to talk about science and write about science instead. So that's how I got to science journalism. I went to the NYU science journalism program, and I've been a science journalist for about 20 years now.
I'm an interloper because I came in sort of through the back door. My journalism career has been mostly in projects and feature stories. And so I came to science because that was what the Washington Post needed. But I had a habit of writing a lot of science stories because I was fascinated by just about every subject in science because it's constantly changing and there are constantly new things to write about. So it's such a rich beat to have. And I think I was an English and philosophy major in college, and then was in a philosophy PhD program at MIT, and also never finished that, just realized I picked a subject that had been around for 5,000 years, and it was really hard to be original, so never wrote the dissertation. But my main interest in philosophy was in questions about identity. And so I fell naturally into interest in neuroscience, which I read a lot about. So it became a kind of natural fit, but I definitely went the circuitous route.
Guess I could go next. Yeah, so my path is, again, I guess like many of us, always had an interest in science, but also politics. And so my, I guess my trajectory has always been looking at understanding how the public thinks about science, and especially when it comes to controversial science, and why we tend to disagree on matters of scientific facts, and understanding, from a social science perspective, what are the different values, attitudes, and beliefs that drive these differences, and how can science communicators and journalists and others, leverage that research to understand better ways to connect science to society, especially when it comes to complex science topics, as well as those that obviously induce a lot of motivated reasoning, which I'm happy to talk more about, and the influences that plays in terms of some of the issues when it comes to engaging different audiences on science.
So for me, I guess I started thinking and being interested in science writing and science communication a little bit later in my career. I was a graduate student already, getting a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology. And I always enjoyed writing, and I always enjoyed reading science journalism, science books, popular science books. And it hadn't really occurred to me that maybe I could write about science in a non-academic way. And once that did occur to me, I didn't know how to do it. So I walked into the office of the student newspaper. This is at the University of Texas at Austin. So the Daily Texan. I walked into their office and asked if they had anybody writing about science, hoping that I'd be able to, learn a little bit from them. And they said, no, why don't you? So I was sort of thrown in the deep end a bit, but had a great editor that worked with me and sort of showed me how you craft a story, how you conduct interviews, and sort of trained me up on how to communicate about science to the public through that format. And I absolutely loved it, and did seriously consider a more sort of traditional path into science journalism as a full-time career, but ended up finishing my PhD and then doing a postdoc, and I got a faculty position where I am now at Rice. But then I sort of came back to science communication, because the way I saw it, teaching students in the classroom about science and communicating about science to the public, in a way, is sort of all part of a similar skill set, right? I think about it as sharing science, and the specific ways that I might do that in the classroom might differ a little bit from the ways that I might write about science or speak about science for an audience, depending on who the audience is. But it's all still about taking scientific information and sharing knowledge and passion. And so I really enjoy doing both of those things, and I see them as being complementary.
Yeah, thank you all for that. It's really great hearing about your valuable and different experiences. And my next question is, what is your typical day in the life? What does it look like? Maybe during COVID, maybe before COVID. What do you think it'll look like after COVID? Yeah, just your thoughts on that.
For me, I think every day is just packed and busy in a way that I really haven't experienced before. I mean, generally you have days that are busier than others. Some days are busier than others. And I think that's true for everybody. But I think during COVID, it's been like the intensity of the busyness is sort of unprecedented for me. Because I feel every minute, like if I'm not engaged in figuring out what's new, what I need to be writing about, what I need to be reporting about, I'm somehow wasting valuable time. So that urgency to get information out, I've never really felt it quite this intensely. But a typical day right now for me, because I'm often working on multiple stories that Friday, for example, I was trying to finish up a story that I filed to my editor. So I was working on that for a good amount of time, but I was also answering some last minute edits on a story that about TB and AI. And my editor on that story had a few questions for me. So I was answering those. Some colleagues were putting together a newsletter about what is like, where are we with COVID and the holidays? And they had asked me and some other people, and Dr. Fauci and some people to comment. And so they sent me a proof of that to look at. So it's like all these, my mind feels like it's constantly shifting between a lot of different stories. And I also interviewed a scientist for yet another story that I'm thinking about. I was on social media. So it's like every day is packed with a lot of different things. And the task switching is definitely very intense during COVID than it's ever been for me.
Well, I could jump in and offer a little bit about sort of what my daily life is like. For me, because I'm an academic, it varies quite a bit from you know, the semester when I'm teaching to you know, summer break or other times when I might not be teaching, and so I tend to sort of focus on different things at different times. So when it's during the semester and I'm teaching, that's my primary focus. I'm, you know, engaged in teaching my students and working with them and doing research. I do still try to stay active on social media, so on Twitter a lot, and starting on Instagram a little bit. But and that's primarily an effort to try to communicate science broadly. But then when I have time to work on other things, I try to take on projects that I feel I can take on and accomplish during the time that I have to focus on them. So, you know, one summer it was writing a book. Another time it's been developing a course for the Great Courses, sort of a adult learning series. And so I try to take on these different types of projects that I can do in a sort of relatively finite period of time that will allow me to then go back and focus on teaching classes during the semester.
Yeah, I guess I can go next as the other academic on this panel. So besides the time that I spend teaching the wonderful undergrads at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I also do quite a bit of research, and we have a research lab that I'm a co-PI with called the Science, Media, and the Public Group. And you know, we've been doing, I mean, the way the group is structured is, you know, every couple of years we do a pretty large national survey on emerging technology issues, and our latest one being artificial intelligence and public attitudes around that. And so some of the, you know, obviously with COVID and that situation, we've been, you know, kind of pivoting a lot of that research to try to integrate it with understanding applications of AI for public health and when it comes to COVID and other examples of where AI can play into you know, more effective you know, diagnosis and responses. So I think that's one of the kind of ways which we've been working now is kind of leveraging some of the existing data sets and resources to try to provide whether it is through kind of the academic literature or other public press around how kind of our background in science communication and risk communication can provide some, you know, frameworks for, you know, thinking effectively about communicating, you know, the complexities of this issue. And then, you know, besides from that, I think one of the joys of being in academia is kind of, you know, all these kind of projects and ideas come up, and you know, now starting new ideas, working with documentary filmmakers and how to think more effectively about communicating documentary films, and you know, really doing it through a kind of unorthodox creative process and trying to integrate different insights into social science research with that. And in general, I think it's, you know, it's fun working in a collaborative environment with undergrads, graduate students, and faculty all focused on kind of science communication research. And, you know, as with COVID's happened, we've been having more meetings than we normally do since it's so easy, but we have a really tight-knit group that, you know, continues to do research on this topic. So a lot of my time is balancing teaching with those ongoing projects.
I have a very boring day right now because I'm working full time on a book called American Madness, which is a narrative history of mental health treatment and mental illness in America. But when I was at the Post doing neuroscience and mental health, really the first thing I did in the morning was, well, first of all, to check what Benedict Carey at the New York Times was doing, but to you know, go to my favorite blogs and websites. Neuroscience is one of those fields that's really changing almost every day, and then a couple of journals just to see what's going on. And obviously what's going on currently that has either neuroscience or mental health aspect.
Yeah, Amy, I think you give a great segue into our next question, which is, over your career, what has been your favorite story or favorite subject to report on, and why?
Well, I'll go first then. I have a lot of favorites. One of them about a woman who had had encephalitis, viral encephalitis at the age of 60, and had retrograde and anterograde amnesia. So she virtually had no memory of her past or her current status, what was going on, and interviewing her at actually in Princeton at her care center, being fascinated by the fact that when I would excuse myself to go to the bathroom and then came back, and she had no idea who I was, so I'd have to reintroduce myself. But the question about, how do we define who a person is? Memory is one of the chief things that almost everyone says. Who are we if we don't have a memory? She has no memory, and her memory is about a minute long. And so it's one of the shortest. She's being studied by neuroscientists. And yet this woman was remarkably happy. She had had to relearn what a fork was and how to speak. And she was a well-known artist, at least in the artist community. She did covers for the New Yorker, the business section of the New York Times on a weekly basis. And slowly recovered her ability to draw in a fascinating way, literally building structures with words hung on them like hangers. So it was just a fascinating case because it involved a lot of philosophical questions about identity and about who we are. And she was a lovely person. She could actually play the viola. That was something that she had not forgotten, and she played it for me. And then she stopped, and then she said, "Would you like me to play the viola?" And so it was kind of a stunning to see someone's illness and the effect of that illness, right there in front of you.
That's really great. I mean, I can't help but jump in there because I'm a neuroscience major myself, and we get taught all of these cases a lot, and hearing it from someone firsthand, a reporter who reported on this story, is really profound.
Yeah, and I just have to add, it's one of the absolutely marvelous things about being a journalist. I can't imagine doing anything else, even though I'm a sort of accidental journalist, and being able to use my sort of philosophy background in what I report on is just enormously gratifying. And as someone else had said before we started this, it allowed me to travel a lot. And that was I was working mostly for a regional newspaper in New Jersey, the Star Ledger, but that's when they were flush with money. And I traveled all over the world pursuing these topics, most of them in science. And so for all those budding, science journalists out there, it's a great life. It is. It really is.
I will strike a little note of caution, though, and say that the state of science journalism is, journalism in general, it's financially a little bit shaky. I mean, I'm lucky enough to work at a paper where we have a very strong science desk, but the Times is one of the only places left, along with the Washington Post, where there's a dedicated science desk. So employment opportunities don't exactly abound at the moment, but if you are interested in it and driven by the passion of it, then it can be a very fulfilling career. I can talk about, I guess, the story that I've really enjoyed working on. I have one that like Amy's was centered sort of on one woman. It was a story about autism and how difficult it is to diagnose women with autism. But the story that I think on a more macro level, a bigger picture that really took me a long time to report and has come to mean a lot to me is about the aftermath of a gas leak in Bhopal, India. I was 11 when this happened, and I was living in India, and I it was a long time ago, and I really vividly remembered the pictures and always wondered what happened. So I had this idea in the back of my head that I wanted to report on it. But when I actually got around to it all these years later, it turned out that the story wasn't even so much what was happening to the people who survived the gas leak. It was that the factory site had been abandoned and had not been cleaned up, and the chemicals were leaching into the groundwater. So the people who moved into that area, there are just, all these little neighborhoods that have sprouted up around it where people have very severe health problems. So I ended up going to Bhopal for the story. It was funded by the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, and I wrote about it for The Atlantic. And I think about that story all the time. And amazingly enough, the story was very well read, but still nothing has changed. It's just stunning to me that, decades after this leak happened, people haven't been compensated adequately, and the factory site is still an uncleaned mess.
That was a fabulous story. I just have to add that it really was fascinating and discouraging, obviously.
Thank you.
For me, I think the topics that I've been most captivated by when it comes to kind of science writing, science communication, have to do with human evolution, and that's actually something that I got interested in as an undergraduate student taking classes in anthropology and biology. And I didn't really follow up on that for many years, but when I started thinking about what I wanted to write about and explore in more detail later, I kept coming back to human evolution, because for me it's sort of about who we are, where we come from. But then I also realized it can also be about where we're going. And so the topic that's captivated me recently has been looking at ways in which human evolution has continued into modern times, is still continuing today, and how it might continue into the future. And that's the topic I ended up writing a book about called Future Humans. And then a little bit of that book, not much, but a little bit of that book explored the possibility for our long-term future and how we might, what could trigger humans to evolve into multiple new species. And I looked into the idea that if we are able to successfully colonize other planets or the moon elsewhere in the solar system or beyond, that could actually trigger evolutionary changes that could lead to new species. And that idea has been one that I've continued to come back to and have been asked to write more about and to talk about, and in the process now of developing a documentary film about. And it's just been fascinating to think about the possibilities for what actually might become of our descendants in the future, and how the decisions that we make today could have these I think very important and surprising consequences for people in the future.
And yeah, I think one of the subjects of research that I've been working on since I finished my PhD, and continue to work on it as well as I've been at Madison, has been this area of science communication training. And before coming to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I was a research associate with the Alan Center for Communicating Science, and I went around the country and the world, working with scientists and postdocs and graduate students about how to more effectively communicate their science, not only to different publics, but also with journalists, with policymakers, and trying to integrate what we know from the social science and science communication into, essentially with my work with them, designing, curriculum that can allow them to, right, with the Aldous Center, engage with improv as a way to do that. And so it's been really eye-opening for me to work with these scientists directly and learn from them and see how they've changed. And a big part of that role was doing evaluations on what effect training even has on scientists when they go through these. And stemming from kind of that interest, my colleagues and I have done a number of surveys of scientists across the US, scientists connected to scientific societies across the country, to understand their willingness to engage, whether it's with journalists or policymakers or other audiences, understanding, their attitudes, how different norms, how different beliefs about, what the impacts are of these different engagement opportunities on, what their goals are, even for these different types of science communication. So I found that as a really unique, opportunity as a researcher, but also I think for a lot of, undergraduate students and others going into science communication, I think, there's a growing area in need for, scientists and those interested in science journalism and communication to, think about how there is this growing and I think, increasingly well-funded, group of organizations that are trying to better connect scientists to journalists and policymakers and other audiences. And I think it's been really fulfilling kind of being involved in that sphere and seeing kind of all of the good work and the challenges that continue to exist in that community. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really great about what you all said is, just the kind of impact you can have on people with scientific journalism. And that brings me to my next question of what do you think is the role of scientific journalism, and is it different from what you see as its current role?
I'm of the belief that the role is the same as it's always been, and that is not just to convey information, but to take a critical eye at how science is done, to look at, if you're looking at experiments on, sample size and research design and things like that. But and as someone who sort of had to learn my way into having that critical eye, it's obviously it's beyond measure. I remember asking a scientist once, why is it that all those stories about the newest Alzheimer's drug with the headlines, mouse recovers, memory completely, and all these, we're right there, we're going to discover something, and he explained to me that mice don't get Alzheimer's. It's something that they have to be engineered to have, and I try and to communicate that in stories, because that's something as a layperson I couldn't understand why these things didn't translate, and yet it was a perfect explanation that I don't think many people know about.
I agree with Amy that I don't think that the definition of science journalism has changed or ever should change. I want to sort of, sharpen what she was saying too about like we're there to hold science accountable, because I think, I end up writing about very sciencey topics and have actually spent the majority of my career writing or editing for scientists. And I think scientists sometimes are under the impression that journalists are their partners, science journalists are their partners in explaining science to the public. That's not at all what science journalism is. And if, among the audience, there are those of you who are really interested in writing about science, there's a whole field of science communication that has nothing to do with journalism. I think if you're a science journalist, you're a journalist. And the job of journalism is to hold people in power accountable. And so in the case of science journalism, that's scientists and science itself. It's our job to ask tough questions, to shine light on things that are poorly understood, poorly done, maliciously done, and to make sure that the truth gets out there.
Yeah, I guess I think about this question as maybe even a broader type of question about sort of different ways in which science is communicated to the public, with science journalism, as we've just heard, being one way in which that's done, which is incredibly important. We need to have people. Our society needs to have people doing exactly what we were just hearing about from Amy and Apurva, where you've got people who are trained as journalists who can hold people to task, who can take a critical eye towards science, while also still connecting people with science. But I think there's a lot of other roles as well. If we think about the whole umbrella of what I'll call science communication, maybe there are other terms to describe that, and Todd probably knows better than I about this. But I do see there being a role also for people who aren't necessarily trained as journalists to do what I call sharing science, right? To connect people with science. As a practicing scientist, I see the problem with one of the problems with science is that it is completely inaccessible to most people. If we read scientific articles where scientific research is being communicated, I mean, that is the language of science is peer-reviewed research articles. And not only are those articles largely not understandable by most people, they're not even accessible to most people because so many journals are, require an expensive subscription to even access. But if you could access them, then being able to actually understand them is not usually possible for people who aren't trained in that specific area. Even other scientists in fields that are adjacent or totally outside of that field are going to struggle to understand that. So I see there as well being a role for people who can understand the science and have the ability to interpret it and make connections. And sometimes that can be being critical, or sometimes that could be, sharing it. So again, that's different from science journalism, but I think it's an important role because people need to be able to have access to information about the science that's happening, to not just to understand it, but to see why it matters and how it's relevant to their everyday lives. So I think there's a lot of different roles for people, and we as a society need all of those people doing all of those roles.
I think that, I'm sorry.
Clarify and say that I 100% agree. I think that those are all really important functions. I just wanted to be very clear about the fact that they don't all fall under the label of science journalism. I think people tend to confuse them all and think that anybody who writes about science is a science journalist, or that all science journalists want to do is write and explain science, and neither of those things is true. I think there's a science communication, which is about communicating science, and then there's science journalism, which is journalism.
Yeah, I think addressing Apurva and Scott, one of the problems with the proliferation of websites and blogs, it's one of the reasons why science journalism is sort of in a golden age where you're not going to get paid for it, but there's so many places where you can contribute. But one of the problems is determining, what's reliable, but also a lot of the websites that are primarily scientists, and you're not going to get the biases necessarily mentioned, or the opposing views of things. You're going to get information, and important information. And how do we, whether or not readers are, want to have to be distinguished, but it seems to me that it's an important thing that needs to be done some way.
Yeah, so I guess I could speak, I guess moving from, the focus of journalism to kind of some of the other career opportunities that a lot of science communication professionals can have. And, I guess I think a lot about this, and the students, the undergrads and graduate students that tend to go into different careers, whether it's in industry, government, the private sector, is, the need for thinking strategically about how to communicate scientists with different audiences. And, sometimes I see that in informal science settings, like, working at zoos or working at different biotechnology companies, and, hosting events for the public for them to, be able to better engage with them. I think we see it in a lot of different areas. And I think, for those, I think, interested in getting into the number of jobs about communicating science, where you are embedded in a different types of organizations, I think a lot of the skill sets that are needed are, and I think one of the things that is important for especially students that are coming from an undergraduate degree in the sciences, and then maybe decide to go into communication or journalism and work in these different types of contexts, is understanding, the different audiences that are out there for when it comes to who you're engaging with, when it comes to, finding ways to meet the public where they are. And I think that's one of the things that's really complicated when it comes to developing and building engagement with science. Is we know that there's a very strong audience for science information, but it's not necessarily always there for the majority of the public. And so I think it's been interesting to see the different types of creative ways that those going into science communication as science communication professionals, and not necessarily journalists, right, are developing in innovative ways, whether it's through digital and social media, whether it's through some of these other informal engagement opportunities to really bring those groups that are typically unrepresented in science itself and in typical engagement with science, and doing that in a way that is palatable and engaging for audiences that maybe don't have a science background. So I think there continues to be a lot of great work being done and great opportunities throughout the country and throughout the world on what we call public engagement with science as a field.
Yeah, I do have one more question before we get to our audience's questions, and this one is a little pressing for me because you guys all kind of touched upon this in your responses, and I'm just wondering what you think about the increased sensationalism in scientific journalism, and how do you get the general public really engaged in your writing and in the stories that you're covering without being overdramatic or having, quote unquote, clickbait titles. And I think, you guys all somewhat touched upon, general engagement in this, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
I think the key to not being overhyping results is to have enough context to say how that piece of information, the finding, fits in with what is generally known about that part of science. I think if you don't give that, it can seem like whiplash for readers to say, one day, oh, masks are, don't protect the wearer, or masks don't work at all. And then now it's like, no, actually wear it for, to protect people around you, but it's not going to protect you. And now it's actually, no, it does actually protect you. So science is this very iterative, incremental process. And I think as a society, we haven't done a fantastic job of teaching people that that's how it works. And so it can seem very confusing to readers. So I think in digital publications, you don't even have to worry about space. So you can just go into all of the context you need to. But even from a print perspective, I think, it's super important. I'm already quite cautious, but also my editors are very cautious. And so that we do a lot of sort of saying up front, the science isn't settled. It's not all there yet. This is just where it's pointing. So we do a lot of that kind of caveating way up high, because as we know, people don't necessarily read all the way through the end. So to say it very quickly, what we know and how this fits in with the overall picture is very important.
Yeah, what's different today as opposed to 10 years ago even, is that now the reporters are generally responsible for writing headlines. They still go through editors, and I'm a terrible headline writer, really just awful. And it's the beauty of Slack is that you get your colleagues to help you out, and there's always an editor there to sort of debate with you or pull you back. But I also think that we underestimate readers, and obviously it's different when you're posting an article on the web as opposed to it appearing in print. But the appetite, I think, for science and science news, especially, important news with regard to COVID or medicine, that there's a great appetite for that. And at the same time, I learned a lesson. My very first project in science was ridiculous. It was the 5 unanswered questions, big questions in science, and the search for consciousness, immortality, the beginning of the universe, the end of the universe. It was a ridiculous project to do, but by the same token, I was thinking, it'd be great to have people read this. Maybe it's only going to be academics and things like that. And my first understanding that it was more than that was when I got a phone call from a retired Newark cop who said, when is the next installment? And my brother walking into Merrill Lynch and seeing a security guard actually highlighting, lines in the story. This was a pure science story. The topics I think were interesting, but again, we've always heard that there's like an 8th grade education level for people who read newspapers, and I don't think that's the case. But again, I think it's an underestimation. By the same token, it's really difficult. It's really difficult to tread that line. Yeah.
I will say though, I just want to point out that I don't write my own headlines.
The New York Times does not.
I mean, you can, and some writers do, but you don't have to. And I was an editor for so many years, and I absolutely loathe writing headlines. So now that I'm not an editor anymore, I take this as one of the rewards of going back to reporting, that I do not have to write my own headlines.
I'm jealous. Yeah, that's great.
I have a question for Amy and Apruva. To what extent, because the headlines, interest me in terms of, how they grab attention. And I'm curious to what extent, A/B testing is done with headlines on the New York Times and on Washington Post, and how that, is obviously something that maybe don't have control over, but I think it's just something interesting in the digital kind of context, how that plays out.
Yeah, I mean, we have A/B testing for sure. They do try out headlines, but I haven't actually had any of my stories go through that. I mean, I think there are people who are savvy about this stuff that look at the headlines and see if they make sense. And I think when it seems like maybe the headline has left out some valuable piece of information or something that they think will resonate with the public, they will suggest some alternatives. And I've seen those conversations happen on Slack, but hasn't actually happened in one of my stories. But because I think my editor, Mike Mason, who's been at the Times for 13 years, I think at this point, he's so good at writing them that I think his first attempt is already fine. So nobody has really tried to change it, but I do see that happening. I think that they do try to do that. And on the back end, when I look at the Times, I can see what the headline is now versus what the search engine optimized headline is. They do have sort of versions.
I was just going to offer, oh, sorry.
No, you go.
I was just going to offer a slightly different take on your question, which is, I mean, I think it is important to worry about the sensationalism, but something else that's related to that I worry about too is what I see as the proliferation of pseudoscience in science communication and journalism, which is to me a very worrying trend. I mean, I think in particular what I see on TV and programming that is, sort of comes across as scientific, that I think can give people, because I agree with Amy, I think people are inherently curious, and we maybe don't give them enough credit for wanting to learn more about scientific topics. But I worry about when that curiosity ends up leading people toward what appears to be scientific content, and then ends up really basically giving credit to pseudoscience that is by most people not considered to be legitimate. And I feel like that has a potentially really damaging effect on how people view science in our country.
And I know we're running. I just want to add one point that I think is really important when we think about this idea of generating, broader interest in science and where science is met. And I think, one of the mediums in which, covers such a broad section of so much of the public, both in the US as abroad, is movies. And the way science is portrayed in movies, there's a great program at the National Academies called the Science and Entertainment Exchange. It tries to bring scientists and the science in with the movies, and even portraying science differently, right? Having more diverse scientists in different roles. And I think when we think about, where are we getting this broad swath of attention, and how can we change these narratives of what science is and who a scientist is, I think, the movies and television and a lot of these edutainment type programs like National Geographic and others, Discovery, right, have a role in this too. And I think there's some really interesting efforts going on, and I'm sure continued opportunities for science communicators that want to get into that type of area.
I just want to mention there were a couple of questions about advice for beginning science writers. So I want to give a shout out to this URL. I think actually my friend Carl was on a different panel. But anyway, if you go to his website, carlzimmer.com, CARLZIMMER.com, he has one of the nav bar things says advice to beginning writers. There, it compiles every sort of every time somebody's been asked this question. We science journalists get this question a lot, so it's all compiled in one place, so you'll be able to get all of your questions answered there.
I love his books too. Because I'm not savvy on answering questions here, I just want to say, email me at amynutt8@gmail.com. Anyone that has a question, because I think I've lost a couple of them in there. So amynutt8@gmail.com. Sorry.
Well, thank you all so much. And in the interest of time, we do have to end. But Apoorva, thank you so much for that information. And thank you all so much for taking your time to speak with us. Your experiences are so valuable, and we really, really appreciate you taking your time to speak with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. This was great.
Hi. Yes, thank you, Elin, and thank you to all of our wonderful panelists. This has been fantastic, and a great last panel to cap off the day.